In the high mountains of Ethiopia, where the air is thin and the land touches the sky, a baby was born who would change the world. The date was July 23, 1892. The place was a small town called Edirse in the eastern part of Ethiopia. Nobody knew that this tiny child would one day become one of the most famous leaders in African history. The baby's name was Rastafari Makanen. His father was a powerful man named Ras Makanen Wold Mikal. In Ethiopia, the word Ras means prince or duke. His father was not just any prince. He was one of the most trusted generals of Emperor Menelik II, the ruler of all Ethiopia. Ras Makanen was the governor of Harar, an important city where traders came from many countries to buy coffee and other goods. The baby's mother was named Yeshimebet Ali Abba Jafar. She came from the Oromo people, who make up a large part of Ethiopia's population. This was important because it connected little Tafari to different groups of people in his country. In Ethiopia, there are many different tribes and languages, and his mother's background would help him understand and speak to all his people when he grew up. The name Tafari has a special meaning. It means one who is respected or one who causes fear. His father chose this name carefully, perhaps knowing that his son would need both respect and strength to lead Ethiopia in the difficult times that were coming. Ethiopia in 1892 was a very different place from the rest of Africa. While European countries had taken control of almost every other African nation, Ethiopia remained free. This was unusual and made Ethiopia special among all African countries. Just 4 years before Tafari was born, Ethiopian warriors had defeated an Italian army at a place called Adwa. This victory shocked the world because it showed that African soldiers could beat European armies. Young Tafari grew up hearing stories about this great victory. His father had fought in that battle alongside Emperor Menelik. These stories filled the boy with pride about his country and his people. He learned that Ethiopia was different from other places in Africa. It was independent, strong, and had never been conquered by white people from Europe. The royal court where Tafari lived was like a school for future leaders. He watched his father meet with important people, make difficult decisions, and solve problems. The boy learned by listening and watching. He saw how his father treated people with respect, but also showed strength when needed. These early lessons would shape how Tafari would lead when he became older. Education was very important in Tafari's family. His father made sure he learned to read and write in Amharic, which is Ethiopia's main language. But Tafari was a very smart child who wanted to learn more. French Catholic priests came to teach him French, and he also learned Arabic and English. This was unusual for Ethiopian children at that time. Most children only learned their local language, but Tafari's father knew that speaking many languages would help his son deal with people from other countries. The young prince was curious about everything. He asked many questions about how other countries worked, what made some nations strong and others weak, and why Ethiopia had stayed free when other African countries had not. His teachers were amazed by how quickly he learned and how well he remembered everything they taught him. When Tafari was still a child, he began to travel with his father to different parts of Ethiopia. These trips taught him about his country and its people. He saw farmers working in the fields, merchants selling goods in busy markets, and soldiers training to defend their homeland. He met people from different tribes who spoke different languages but all called themselves Ethiopian. These experiences helped him understand that Ethiopia was like a big family made up of many different groups. Life in the royal court also taught Tafari about the outside world. Visitors came from many countries to meet with Emperor Menelik and his governors. Tafari listened to these foreigners speak about their homes. He learned about countries across the sea, about new inventions like trains and telegraphs, and about how the world was changing very quickly. The boy was especially interested in learning about other African countries. He heard sad stories about how European countries had taken control of these places and how African people had lost their freedom. This made him even more proud of Ethiopia's independence, but it also worried him. He wondered if Ethiopia could stay free forever or if someday foreign armies might try to conquer his homeland too. When Tafari was 12 years old, something very sad happened. His beloved father became sick and died. This was a terrible loss for the young boy, but it also meant he had to grow up quickly. As his father's son, Tafari inherited land, money, and most importantly, a position of respect in Ethiopian society. People expected him to become a leader just like his father had been. Emperor Menelik noticed the young prince and decided to bring him closer to the royal court in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia's capital city. This was a great honor and showed that the emperor saw something special in Tafari. Living in the capital gave the teenager even more chances to learn about politics, diplomacy, and leadership. In the royal court, Tafari met young people from noble families across Ethiopia. He made friends but also learned to be careful about who he trusted. Court life could be dangerous because different groups of nobles often fought for power and influence. The smart young man learned to listen more than he spoke and to think carefully before making decisions. As he grew into a young man, Tafari began to develop his own ideas about how Ethiopia should be governed. He believed his country needed to learn from other nations without losing its own culture and independence. He wanted Ethiopia to have modern schools, hospitals, and roads like European countries, but he also wanted to keep Ethiopian traditions and customs. By the time he reached his 20s, Rastafari had become known throughout Ethiopia as an intelligent and capable young leader. People respected him not just because of his famous father, but because of his own abilities. He spoke well, made fair decisions, and seemed to understand both old Ethiopian ways and new ideas from around the world. The young man who had been born in a small mountain town was ready to step onto the big stage of Ethiopian politics. He had learned everything he needed to know about leadership, diplomacy, and the challenges facing his country. Soon, he would get the chance to use these skills to help shape Ethiopia's future and earn his place in history as one of Africa's greatest leaders. The year 1916 changed everything for Rastafari and for Ethiopia. He was now 24 years old, no longer the curious boy from the mountains, but a confident young man with big dreams for his country. What happened that year would put him on the path to becoming one of the most famous leaders in the world. Emperor Menelik had died a few years earlier, and the crown had passed to his grandson, Ieyasu, but Ieyasu was causing problems for Ethiopia. He was making friends with countries that were enemies of Britain and France during the Great War that was happening in Europe. Even worse, people said he was turning away from Christianity and becoming a Muslim. This made many Ethiopian nobles very angry because Ethiopia had been a Christian country for over 1,000 years. Rastafari saw that Iyasu's actions were putting Ethiopia in danger. If Ethiopia sided with Germany and Turkey in the war, the British might decide to invade Ethiopia from their colonies nearby. This could end Ethiopia's precious independence that his father and Emperor Menelik had fought so hard to protect. Working quietly with other nobles, Rastafari helped plan to remove Iyasu from power. It was a dangerous plan because if it failed, Tafari could be killed or thrown in prison. But he believed it was necessary to save his country. In September 1916, the plan worked. Iyasu was forced to give up the throne, and Menelik's daughter, Zudichu, became empress. However, Zudichu was a woman, and many people in Ethiopia believed that women should not rule alone. So, the nobles decided that Rastafari would become regent, which meant he would help the empress make important decisions. In reality, this made Tafari the most powerful person in Ethiopia, even though he was not yet the official ruler. Being regent was exactly what Rastafari had been preparing for his whole life. He had watched, learned, and planned, and now he could finally put his ideas into action. He wanted to make Ethiopia into a modern country that could stand equal with any nation in the world. His first big success came in 1923, when he convinced the League of Nations to let Ethiopia join their organization. The League of Nations was like the United Nations today, where countries came together to solve problems peacefully. Ethiopia became the first African country to join this important group. This was amazing because it meant that Ethiopia was recognized as an equal partner by the most powerful countries in the world. Getting into the League of Nations was not easy. Some European countries did not want to let an African nation join their club. They thought African people were not civilized enough to participate in world affairs. But Rastafari was very smart about how he handled this challenge. He spoke to them in their own languages, showed that he understood international law, and proved that Ethiopia was just as capable as any European nation. This success made Rastafari famous around the world. Newspapers in Europe and America wrote stories about the brilliant young African leader who was bringing his ancient country into the modern world. People were impressed that someone so young could achieve such an important diplomatic victory. But Rastafari knew that joining the League of Nations was just the beginning. He wanted to show the world that Ethiopia could be a truly modern country. In 1924, he decided to do something that no Ethiopian ruler had ever done before. He would travel to Europe and other countries to see how they lived and learn what Ethiopia could copy to become stronger. His trip to Europe was like a grand adventure. He visited England, France, Italy, Belgium, and several other countries. Everywhere he went, people came out to see the African prince who spoke perfect French and English and who carried himself like the kings of Europe. He met with presidents and prime ministers, visited factories and schools, and studied everything from hospitals to telephone systems. The trip taught Rastafari many important lessons. He saw how European countries used machines to make their people's lives easier. He learned about new ways to teach children, treat sick people, and communicate across long distances. He also saw how these countries organized their governments and armies to be more efficient. When he returned to Ethiopia, Rastafari was full of new ideas. He immediately began working to bring these modern improvements to his own country. He started by focusing on education because he believed that smart, educated people were the key to making any country successful. In 1925, he opened a new school called Tufari Makanin School. This was not like the old Ethiopian schools that only taught religion. This new school taught students about science, mathematics, foreign languages, and world history. He brought teachers from other countries to help Ethiopian teachers learn new methods. This school would later become a university and would educate many of the leaders who would help build modern Ethiopia. Rastafari also worked to improve communication in Ethiopia. He ordered the building of telephone lines to connect different cities. He started a postal system so people could send letters across the country. He even began planning for roads and railways that would make it easier for people and goods to move around Ethiopia. But not everyone was happy with all these changes. Some of the old nobles thought Rastafari was moving too fast and changing too many things. They liked the old ways and did not want foreign ideas coming into Ethiopia. Some religious leaders also worried that all these new ideas from Europe might weaken Ethiopian Christianity. The biggest tension was between Rastafari and Empress Zudichu herself. She was more traditional and conservative. She did not like many of the changes he wanted to make. Sometimes they disagreed so strongly that it seemed like Ethiopia might have a civil war between those who supported the Empress and those who supported the regent. Rastafari had to be very careful during these difficult times. He could not push too hard for changes or he might lose his position. But he also could not give up on his dreams for Ethiopia's future. He learned to be patient, to compromise when necessary, and to wait for the right moment to move forward with his plans. Despite these challenges, Rastafari continued to gain respect both inside Ethiopia and around the world. Foreign visitors to Ethiopia always asked to meet with him because they knew he was the one who really understood how to deal with other countries. His reputation as a skilled diplomat and a visionary leader continued to grow. By 1930, it was clear that Rastafari had become the most important person in Ethiopia. He had proven that he could handle international affairs, implement domestic reforms, and maintain the delicate balance of Ethiopian politics. When Empress Zudichu died unexpectedly in April 1930, there was no question about who should become the next ruler. The young man who had started as a curious prince from the mountains was now ready to become emperor of one of the world's oldest independent nations. November 2, 1930 was a day that the world would never forget. In the ancient city of Addis Ababa, something magnificent was about to happen. Rastafari Makanin was going to become Emperor Haile Selassie I, ruler of Ethiopia. The coronation ceremony would be unlike anything Africa had ever seen before. The name Haile Selassie means power of the Trinity in the ancient Ethiopian language. By choosing this name, the new emperor was showing his deep faith in God and his belief that divine power would help him lead his people. From now on, the world would know him not as Rastafari, but as Emperor Haile Selassie. The coronation ceremony was planned to show the entire world that Ethiopia was a great and civilized nation. Representatives came from many countries including Britain, France, Italy, and the United States. They brought expensive gifts and watched in amazement as the ancient Ethiopian traditions unfolded before their eyes. The emperor wore magnificent robes made of the finest silk and gold. On his head was placed the ancient crown of Ethiopian emperors, studded with precious jewels that had been collected over centuries. In his hands he held the golden scepter and orb that symbolized his power over all of Ethiopia. The ceremony was conducted in the ancient Ethiopian language of Ge'ez, with priests chanting prayers that had been sung for over 1,000 years. Foreign reporters and photographers captured every moment of the grand event. Their pictures and stories were published in newspapers around the world, showing millions of people that Africa had produced a leader who was every bit as impressive as any European king or president. This was exactly what Emperor Haile Selassie wanted to achieve. Now that he was emperor with full power, Haile Selassie could finally implement all the changes he had been dreaming about for years. His first major accomplishment was creating Ethiopia's first written constitution in 1931. This was a historic document that established how the government would work and what rights Ethiopian people would have. The constitution was carefully written to balance old Ethiopian traditions with modern ideas about government. It said that the emperor had supreme power, which satisfied the traditional nobles, but it also created a parliament where different groups could discuss important issues. It promised that all Ethiopians would be treated fairly under the law, regardless of what tribe they came from or what religion they followed. Creating this constitution was not easy. Many old nobles did not want any limits on the emperor's power, while some younger, educated Ethiopians wanted more democracy right away. Emperor Haile Selassie had to find a middle path that would satisfy both groups while moving Ethiopia toward becoming a more modern country. The emperor also created Ethiopia's first real government ministries, similar to what European countries had. There was a Ministry of Education to build schools, a Ministry of Health to improve medical care, a Ministry of Public Works to build roads and bridges, and many others. Each ministry was led by someone who understood that particular area and could make expert decisions. Education remained the emperor's highest priority. He believed that Ethiopia could only become truly modern if its people were educated and could think for themselves. He continued expanding the school system he had started as regent, building new schools in cities and towns across the country. In 1950, the emperor achieved one of his greatest dreams by establishing Haile Selassie, the first university in Addis Ababa. This was Ethiopia's first real university, where young Ethiopians could study advanced subjects like medicine, engineering, law, and science. He brought professors from many different countries to teach there, and he also sent the brightest Ethiopian students to study in universities in Europe and America. The emperor often visited the university personally to talk with students and professors. He wanted to make sure they understood that education was not just about getting good jobs, but about serving their country and helping to build a better future for all Ethiopian people. During these golden years, Emperor Haile Selassie became one of the most respected leaders in the world. He traveled to many countries and met with presidents, prime ministers, and other emperors as an equal. Foreign leaders were impressed by his intelligence, his knowledge of world affairs, and his ability to speak several languages fluently. In 1954, the emperor made a historic visit to the United States, where he met with President Dwight Eisenhower and spoke to the United Nations. His speech at the UN was powerful and moving. He talked about the need for all nations to work together for peace and to treat each other with respect, regardless of race or religion. The emperor also began talking about something that was far ahead of its time, the idea that all African countries should work together. While most of Africa was still controlled by European colonial powers, Emperor Haile Selassie was already imagining a future where African nations would be independent and would cooperate with each other. He used every opportunity to speak out against colonialism and racism. In his speeches and in meetings with other world leaders, he argued that African people were just as capable as anyone else and deserved to govern themselves. This message inspired many African independence movements that were just beginning to organize. At home in Ethiopia, the emperor continued his modernization programs. He established the Ethiopian Red Cross to help people during emergencies and disasters. He created the first Ethiopian National Bank to help the country's economy grow. He built hospitals in major cities and invited foreign doctors to come and train Ethiopian medical students. The emperor also worked to improve communication and transportation within Ethiopia. Telephone lines connected the major cities, allowing people to talk to each other across great distances for the first time. New roads made it easier for farmers to bring their crops to market and for people to travel between different parts of the country. Perhaps most importantly, the emperor began the slow process of modernizing Ethiopia's ancient legal system. He established new courts with trained judges who could make fair decisions based on written laws rather than just local customs. This was a huge change for a country where justice had traditionally been handled by local chiefs and religious leaders. All of these achievements made the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s truly a golden age for Ethiopia. The country was independent, modernizing rapidly, and respected around the world. Emperor Haile Selassie had succeeded in his goal of making Ethiopia a modern nation while preserving its ancient culture and independence. But even during these successful years, there were signs of troubles ahead. Some Ethiopians felt that the emperor was changing things too slowly, while others thought he was changing things too quickly. The challenge of balancing tradition with progress would continue to test his leadership in the years to come. The morning of October 3, 1935 started like any other day in Ethiopia, but it would end with the beginning of one of the most important wars in African history. On that day, Italian soldiers crossed the border from their colony in Eritrea and began invading Ethiopia. The man who ordered this attack was Benito Mussolini, the dictator of Italy, who wanted to build a great empire in Africa. Emperor Haile Selassie had been expecting this attack for months. He knew that Mussolini was angry because Italy had been defeated by Ethiopia at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. That old defeat had embarrassed Italy in front of the whole world, and now Mussolini wanted revenge. He also wanted to show other European countries that Italy was still a great power that could conquer new territories. But this invasion was different from the one 40 years earlier. This time, the Italians came with modern weapons that Ethiopian soldiers had never seen before. They had airplanes that could drop bombs from the sky, tanks that could smash through Ethiopian defenses, and worst of all, poison gas that could kill hundreds of people at once. Emperor Haile Selassie knew that his army was not strong enough to fight such modern weapons with their old rifles and spears. But he also knew that he could not simply surrender and let his country be conquered. Ethiopia had been free for thousands of years, and he would rather die than let it become an Italian colony. The emperor decided to do something that shocked many of his advisors. Instead of staying safely in his palace, he would personally lead his soldiers into battle against the Italian invaders. He put on his military uniform, gathered his best generals, and traveled to the front lines where the fighting was happening. For several months, Ethiopian soldiers fought with incredible bravery against the Italian army. They won some battles and showed the world that they would not give up easily. The emperor himself was often close to the fighting, encouraging his men and showing them that he was willing to share their dangers. But the Italians had too many advantages. Their airplanes bombed Ethiopian cities and villages, killing innocent people who had nothing to do with the war. Their poison gas made it impossible for Ethiopian soldiers to defend certain areas. Slowly but surely, the Italian army began moving deeper into Ethiopia. The worst part was that the rest of the world did almost nothing to help Ethiopia. The League of Nations, which Ethiopia had joined with such pride in 1923, held meetings and made speeches but took no real action to stop the Italian invasion. Britain and France, the most powerful members of the League, were afraid that if they fought Italy, it might push Mussolini to become allies with Adolf Hitler in Germany. By early 1936, it became clear that Ethiopia could not win this war by fighting alone. The Italian army was getting closer and closer to Addis Ababa, the capital city. Emperor Haile Selassie faced the most difficult decision of his life. Should he retreat to the mountains and continue fighting a guerrilla war that might last for years, or should he try a different approach? The emperor made a choice that many people did not understand at the time. Instead of fighting to the death in Ethiopia, he would go to Europe and appeal directly to the conscience of the world. He believed that if he could speak directly to the leaders and people of other countries, he might be able to convince them to help Ethiopia. In May 1936, as Italian soldiers marched into Addis Ababa, Emperor Haile Selassie and his family escaped from Ethiopia and traveled to Europe. Many Ethiopians felt abandoned by their emperor, but he had a plan that was bigger than just military resistance. On June 30, 1936, Emperor Haile Selassie stood before the Assembly of the League of Nations in Geneva, Switzerland. This was his chance to speak to representatives from 50 countries and tell them what was really happening in Ethiopia. What he said that day would be remembered forever as one of the greatest speeches in history. The emperor walked to the podium wearing his simple white Ethiopian robe, looking dignified and calm despite everything he had been through. As he began to speak in his native Amharic language, Italian journalists in the audience started shouting and making noise to try to interrupt him. But the emperor continued speaking, his voice growing stronger and more powerful. His words were translated into many languages so that people around the world could understand his message. He told the assembled delegates about the terrible things the Italians had done in Ethiopia. He described how they had used poison gas against defenseless villages, how they had bombed hospitals and schools, and how they had killed thousands of innocent people. But the most powerful part of his speech was when he warned the other countries about what would happen if they did nothing to stop this aggression. He said that if small countries like Ethiopia could be attacked and conquered without any consequences, then no country would be safe. He spoke the words that would echo through history. It is us today, it will be you tomorrow. The emperor was telling them that if they allowed Italy to conquer Ethiopia, other aggressive countries would think they could do the same thing. He was warning them that World War might be coming and that they needed to stop aggression now before it spread to other parts of the world. The speech lasted only about 30 minutes, but its impact was enormous. People who heard it said they had never seen such dignity and moral courage. Here was a man who had lost his country and his throne, but who still stood before the world with his head held high, speaking not just for Ethiopia but for all small nations that might face similar attacks. Newspapers around the world printed the full text of the emperor's speech. Millions of people read his words and were moved by his message. In Africa, people who had never heard of Ethiopia before suddenly knew about this brave emperor who had dared to challenge the powerful countries of Europe. Unfortunately, the League of Nations did not take strong action to help Ethiopia. They passed some weak resolutions and imposed some limited sanctions on Italy, but these measures were not enough to force the Italians to leave Ethiopia. The emperor's speech had been morally powerful, but it did not immediately save his country. However, the emperor's words proved to be prophetic. Just as he had warned, the failure to stop Italian aggression in Ethiopia encouraged other dictators to believe they could attack their neighbors without serious consequences. Within 3 years, World War II had begun, and the emperor's prediction that it will be you tomorrow came true for many of the countries that had refused to help Ethiopia. The speech made Emperor Haile Selassie famous around the world as a symbol of resistance against fascism and colonialism. Even though he had lost his throne, he had gained something perhaps more valuable: the respect and admiration of people everywhere who believed in justice and freedom. After his famous speech at the League of Nations, Emperor Haile Selassie found himself in a strange and difficult situation. He was still an emperor, but he had no empire to rule. He was still a leader, but his people were thousands of miles away under Italian occupation. He was one of the most famous men in the world, but he was also homeless. The British government offered him a place to live in England, and the emperor accepted this offer. In late 1936, he arrived in the quiet English city of Bath, where he would spend the next 5 years of his life. The house where he lived was called Fairfield House, a modest but comfortable home that was very different from the grand palaces he was used to in Ethiopia. Life in exile was hard for the emperor in ways that most people could not imagine. Every morning when he woke up, he had to face the reality that his country was occupied by foreign soldiers, and his people were suffering under Italian rule. He received letters from Ethiopians who had escaped to other countries, telling him about the terrible things happening in their homeland. The Italians were trying to destroy everything that made Ethiopia special. They were forcing Ethiopian children to learn Italian instead of their own languages. They were taking the best farmland for Italian settlers. They were even trying to make Ethiopians forget their own history and culture. For the emperor, who loved his country's ancient traditions, this was almost too painful to bear. But Emperor Haile Selassie refused to give up hope. He established a daily routine that kept him focused on his goal of returning to Ethiopia someday. Every morning, he would wake up early and spend time in prayer, asking God to give him strength and to protect his people. Then he would read newspapers from around the world to understand what was happening in international politics. The emperor spent many hours each day writing letters to world leaders, trying to keep the Ethiopian cause alive in their minds. He wrote to the President of the United States, to the King of England, to the leaders of France and other countries. In these letters, he reminded them about his speech at the League of Nations and asked them not to forget about Ethiopia. He also worked hard to help Ethiopian refugees who had escaped from their country during the Italian invasion. Many of these people had lost everything and needed help finding places to live and work. The emperor used his own money and his connections with important people to help as many refugees as possible. During these years in England, the emperor's children had to adapt to a completely different way of life. His sons and daughters went to British schools, where they learned to speak English perfectly and studied subjects they had never heard of in Ethiopia. This was important because the emperor knew that when they returned to Ethiopia, they would need to understand both Ethiopian traditions and modern international ways of thinking. The emperor himself continued learning during his exile. He studied international law, trying to understand how countries could use legal arguments to solve their problems. He read books about economics, politics, and military strategy. He met with scholars and experts who taught him about new developments in science and technology. One of the most important things the emperor learned during his exile was patience. In Ethiopia, when he wanted something done, he could simply give an order and it would happen. But in exile, he had to learn to wait, to persuade people instead of commanding them, and to accept that change often happened very slowly. The emperor also had to deal with people who thought he should give up his dream of returning to Ethiopia. Some well-meaning friends suggested that he should accept a pension from the British government and live quietly as a private citizen. They told him that Italy was too strong and that Ethiopia would never be free again. But the emperor never seriously considered giving up. He believed that God had made him emperor for a purpose, and that purpose included protecting Ethiopian independence. He also received encouraging messages from Ethiopian resistance fighters who were still fighting against the Italians inside Ethiopia. These brave men and women reminded him that the Ethiopian spirit had not been broken. In 1939, something happened that changed everything. Germany invaded Poland and World War II began. The emperor immediately understood that this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. Italy was now on Germany's side, which meant that Britain and France were fighting against Italy. If the emperor could convince the British to help him fight against Italy and Ethiopia, it would help both Ethiopia and Britain at the same time. The emperor began meeting with British military and political leaders, offering to help them fight against Italian forces in East Africa. He knew the geography of Ethiopia better than any European, and he understood the languages and customs of its people. Most importantly, he knew that many Ethiopians were ready to rise up against the Italians if they had help and leadership. At first, some British officials were not sure they wanted to work with the emperor. They worried that bringing him back to Ethiopia might create more problems than it would solve. But as the war continued and Britain needed all the help it could get, they began to see the value of having the emperor on their side. The emperor proved to be very useful to the British war effort. He provided detailed maps of Ethiopia showing where Italian forces were located. He explained which Ethiopian tribes and regions were most likely to support a rebellion against the Italians. He even helped train British and other Allied soldiers who would be fighting in Ethiopian territory. During his exile, the emperor also suffered personal losses that tested his faith and determination. Some of his close friends and relatives died, and he could not even attend their funerals because he was so far from home. These losses reminded him of how much the Italian invasion had cost him personally, not just as an emperor but as a man. By 1940, after 4 long years in exile, the emperor could finally see hope on the horizon. The British were planning a military campaign to drive the Italians out of East Africa, and they wanted the emperor to be part of that campaign. The man who had left Ethiopia as a defeated ruler was about to return as the leader of a liberation army. The years in exile had changed Emperor Haile Selassie in important ways. He had learned to work with people from different countries and cultures. He had gained a deeper understanding of international politics and military strategy. Most importantly, he had proven to himself and to the world that his commitment to Ethiopian freedom was stronger than any temporary defeat. May 5, 1941 was a day that millions of Ethiopians had dreamed about for 5 long years. On that morning, Emperor Haile Selassie stood at the gates of Addis Ababa, ready to enter his capital city as a free man returning to a free country. Exactly 5 years had passed since he had fled from the Italian invasion, and now he was coming home as the victor. The emperor was not alone on this historic day. Behind him marched Ethiopian soldiers who had fought bravely alongside British and South African forces to drive the Italians out of their homeland. These men had proven that Ethiopian courage and determination were just as strong as any modern army when they had the right weapons and support. The campaign to liberate Ethiopia had begun months earlier when the emperor left his exile in England and traveled to Sudan, which bordered Ethiopia. There, he met with British military commanders who were planning to attack Italian forces throughout East Africa. The emperor's knowledge of Ethiopian geography and his understanding of local politics made him an invaluable partner in planning this campaign. Working with a British officer named Orde Wingate, the emperor had helped organize Ethiopian resistance fighters who had been hiding in the mountains and forests for years. These brave men and women had never stopped fighting against the Italian occupation, even when they had no help from the outside world. When they learned that their emperor was coming back with British support, thousands of them came out of hiding to join the Liberation Army. The military campaign had been difficult and dangerous. Ethiopian and British forces had to march through some of the most challenging terrain in Africa, crossing mountains, deserts, and thick forests while fighting Italian soldiers who knew the land well. But the emperor's presence with the Liberation Army inspired the Ethiopian fighters to perform acts of incredible bravery. During the fighting, the emperor proved that he was not just a political leader, but also a military commander. He rode with his soldiers, shared their dangers, and made important tactical decisions that helped win key battles. His willingness to risk his own life for Ethiopian freedom earned him even greater respect from his people and from the British officers who worked with him. Now, as he entered Addis Ababa on that glorious morning in May, the emperor could see that the Italian occupation had left deep scars on his country. Many buildings had been damaged or destroyed. The Italians had stolen valuable artifacts from Ethiopian churches and museums. They had also tried to change Ethiopian society by forcing people to adopt Italian customs and language. But the most important thing the emperor noticed was the joy on the faces of the Ethiopian people who came out to welcome him home. Thousands of people lined the streets, singing traditional songs and waving Ethiopian flags that had been hidden during the occupation. Children who had grown up under Italian rule were seeing their true emperor for the first time. The emperor's first speech after returning to power set the tone for how he would govern in the post-war years. Instead of calling for revenge against Ethiopians who had collaborated with the Italians, he spoke about forgiveness and unity. He said that Ethiopia needed all of its people to work together to rebuild their country, regardless of what they had done during the occupation. This decision to pursue reconciliation rather than revenge was not popular with everyone. Many Ethiopians felt that people who had helped the Italians should be punished severely. But the emperor understood that seeking revenge would only create more divisions in Ethiopian society at a time when unity was essential for reconstruction. The emperor immediately began working to repair the damage caused by 5 years of foreign occupation. His first priority was restoring Ethiopian institutions that the Italians had tried to destroy. He reopened Ethiopian schools and universities, brought back Ethiopian laws and customs, and restored the Ethiopian Orthodox Church to its proper place in society. Education remained one of the emperor's highest priorities. During the occupation, many Ethiopian children had been forced to attend Italian schools where they learned in Italian rather than their native languages. The emperor ordered the immediate reopening of Ethiopian schools and the training of new teachers, who could help children reconnect with their Ethiopian heritage. In 1950, the emperor achieved one of his greatest dreams by establishing Haile Selassie, the first university in Addis Ababa. This was not just a replacement for the educational institutions that had existed before the war, but something entirely new and ambitious. The university would train doctors, engineers, lawyers, and other professionals that Ethiopia needed to become a truly modern country. The emperor also focused on building Ethiopia's infrastructure, which had been severely damaged during the war. He ordered the construction of new roads to connect different parts of the country, new hospitals to improve healthcare, and new communication systems to help the government work more efficiently. But perhaps the emperor's most important achievement during this period was his work to establish Ethiopia as a leader in international affairs. He understood that the world had changed dramatically during World War II, and that small countries like Ethiopia needed to work together to protect their independence and promote their interests. In 1945, Ethiopia became one of the founding members of the United Nations, the organization that replaced the failed League of Nations. This was a moment of great pride for the emperor, who remembered how the League of Nations had failed to help Ethiopia during the Italian invasion. He was determined that the United Nations would be stronger and more effective than its predecessor. The emperor also began promoting the idea that African countries should work together to achieve independence and development. Most of Africa was still under European colonial rule in the 1940s and 1950s, but the emperor could see that change was coming. He wanted Ethiopia to be ready to help other African nations when they became independent. During this period, the emperor also strengthened Ethiopia's relationships with major world powers, particularly the United States. He understood that Ethiopia needed powerful allies to protect its independence and to help with its development programs. His skill in international diplomacy helped Ethiopia secure military and economic assistance that was crucial for the country's reconstruction. The emperor's success in rebuilding Ethiopia after the war demonstrated his remarkable abilities as a leader. He had not only survived one of the most challenging periods in Ethiopian history, but had emerged stronger and more respected than ever before. The man who had left Ethiopia as a defeated exile had returned as a victorious leader, ready to guide his country into a new era of progress and prosperity. By the 1960s, Emperor Haile Selassie had ruled Ethiopia for over 30 years and had become one of the most famous leaders in the world. But the world was changing rapidly, and new challenges were emerging that would test his leadership in ways he had never experienced before. The decade began with a shocking event that would shake his confidence and force him to realize that not everyone in Ethiopia was happy with his rule. In December 1960, while the emperor was visiting Brazil on a diplomatic mission, something terrible happened back home in Addis Ababa. A group of young military officers and educated civilians attempted to overthrow his government and replace him with his own son, Crown Prince Asfa Wasson. This coup attempt was led by two brothers named Germain and Mengistu Niue, who believed that Ethiopia needed faster and more dramatic changes than the emperor was willing to make. The news of the coup attempt reached the emperor while he was thousands of miles away from home. For 3 days, he did not know whether he still had a country to rule or whether his government had been completely destroyed. It was one of the most frightening experiences of his entire life, even worse than fleeing from the Italian invasion because this time the threat came from his own people. The coup failed when loyal army units fought against the rebels and restored order in the capital. But the damage to the emperor's reputation was serious. For the first time, people around the world learned that some Ethiopians were not satisfied with their emperor's leadership. The rebels had issued a statement saying that they wanted to end poverty, give land to farmers, and create a more democratic government. When the emperor returned to Ethiopia, he had to face some uncomfortable truths. The coup attempt had been supported by many young, educated Ethiopians who felt that he was not changing the country fast enough. These were the same people who had benefited from the schools and universities he had built, but they wanted more political freedom and faster social reforms. The emperor tried to respond to these concerns by making some changes to his government. He gave more power to parliament and promised to speed up land reforms that would help poor farmers. But many critics felt that these changes were too small and too late. They wanted him to give up much of his power and allow other people to make important decisions about Ethiopia's future. Around the same time, another serious problem was developing in Eritrea, the region along the Red Sea that had been part of Ethiopia since the end of World War II. Many Eritreans had never wanted to be part of Ethiopia and had been demanding independence or at least self-government. In 1962, the emperor made the decision to fully incorporate Eritrea as just another province of Ethiopia, ending the special federal arrangement that had existed since 1950. This decision led to the beginning of a long and bloody war that would drain Ethiopia's resources for the next 30 years. Eritrean independence fighters began attacking Ethiopian government buildings, army bases, and other targets. The emperor had to send thousands of Ethiopian soldiers to fight in Eritrea, and many of them never came home. The war in Eritrea was particularly difficult for the emperor, because it contradicted everything he had been saying about African unity and self-determination. Here he was, an African leader who had spent decades calling for the independence of African countries from European colonial rule, but he was fighting to prevent Eritreans from becoming independent from Ethiopian rule. The 1960s also brought a new generation of student protesters, who were much more radical than earlier critics of the emperor's government. These young people had grown up during the golden years of his reign and had received good educations in the schools and universities he had built. But instead of being grateful, they were angry that Ethiopia was still one of the poorest countries in the world, despite decades of modernization efforts. Student demonstrations became common in Addis Ababa and other Ethiopian cities. The protesters carried signs demanding land reform, workers' rights, and democratic government. They criticized the emperor for living in luxury while most Ethiopians remained poor farmers working on land owned by wealthy nobles. The emperor found it difficult to understand why these young people were so angry with him. He had given them opportunities for education that their parents never had. He had built roads, hospitals, and schools throughout the country. He had made Ethiopia respected around the world. But the students seemed to care more about abstract ideas like equality and democracy than about the practical improvements he had made. The emperor's response to the student protests was a mixture of tolerance and firmness. He allowed peaceful demonstrations to continue, but he used police and soldiers to break up protests that became violent. He also tried to address some of the students' concerns by promising faster reforms, but this only seemed to encourage them to demand even more changes. International events during the 1960s also created new pressures for the emperor. The civil rights movement in the United States and the wave of independence movements across Africa made ideas about equality and self-determination very popular around the world. Many young Ethiopians were inspired by leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and by the success of independence movements in other African countries. The emperor tried to stay ahead of these trends by positioning himself as a leader of African independence and unity. In 1963, he played a key role in establishing the Organization of African Unity, with its headquarters in Addis Ababa. This was a great honor for Ethiopia and showed that other African leaders still respected the emperor's wisdom and experience, but even this success created new problems for the emperor. As more African countries became independent and established their own governments, many of them adopted more democratic political systems than Ethiopia had. This made the emperor's absolute monarchy seem old-fashioned and out of step with modern African politics. Perhaps the most serious challenge the emperor faced during this period was the growing sophistication of his critics. Unlike earlier opponents who had simply wanted to replace him with another strong leader, the new generation of critics had detailed plans for transforming Ethiopian society. They had studied political systems in other countries and had specific ideas about land reform, workers' rights and democratic government. The emperor, who had always been able to stay ahead of his opponents by being smarter and more knowledgeable than they were, now found himself facing critics who were just as educated and informed as he was. For the first time in his long career, he was no longer the most modern and progressive person in Ethiopian politics. By the end of the 1960s, it was clear that the emperor's authority was being seriously challenged from many different directions. The man who had once seemed unshakable was now facing pressures that would only grow stronger in the years ahead. The year 1974 began like many others for Emperor Haile Selassie, but it would end with the destruction of everything he had built over nearly 6 decades of leadership. The emperor was now 82 years old, and though his mind was still sharp, his body was becoming frail. He had no idea that this would be the last year of his long and remarkable reign. The trouble started in a way that seemed small and unimportant. In January 1974, taxi drivers in Addis Ababa went on strike because the government had raised the price of gasoline. This made it more expensive for them to operate their taxis, and they demanded that the government either lower the gas prices or allow them to charge passengers more money. Normally, a taxi strike would not be a serious problem for the government. But this time, other groups of workers saw the taxi drivers protesting and decided to join them. Teachers went on strike demanding better pay and working conditions. Government employees stopped working because they wanted higher salaries. Even soldiers began complaining about their low wages and poor living conditions. What made these protests different from earlier ones was that they were happening at the same time as a terrible drought in northern Ethiopia. For 2 years, the rains had failed in provinces like Tigray and Wallo, and hundreds of thousands of people were starving. The government had tried to hide this disaster from the world, but foreign journalists eventually discovered what was happening and began reporting about it. The contrast between the suffering of ordinary Ethiopians and the comfortable life of the royal court became impossible to ignore. Television programs showed shocking images of skeletal children dying of hunger while the emperor continued to live in his palace surrounded by luxury. One British documentary called The Unknown Famine was particularly damaging because it showed the emperor feeding meat to his pet lions while his people starved. As the protests and strikes continued throughout the spring of 1974, a new group emerged that would ultimately bring down the emperor's government. This group called itself the Coordinating Committee of the Armed Forces, Police, and Territorial Army, but everyone knew it simply as the Derg, which means committee in the Amharic language. The Derg was different from previous groups that had opposed the emperor because it was made up mainly of young military officers, sergeants, and corporals rather than high-ranking generals or civilian politicians. These were men who had been fighting in the war in Eritrea and had seen firsthand how the government's policies were failing. They were angry about their low pay, poor equipment, and the fact that they were dying in a war that seemed to have no end. The leader of the Derg was a major named Mengistu Haile Mariam, a man who had grown up poor and had worked his way up through the army ranks. Mengistu had very different ideas about how Ethiopia should be governed. He believed in socialist and communist principles that called for giving land to the peasants, nationalizing businesses, and creating a government controlled by workers and soldiers rather than by nobles and traditional leaders. At first, the emperor tried to deal with the growing crisis by making small changes to his government. He appointed new prime ministers and promised to investigate corruption and make reforms. But each concession only encouraged the protesters to demand more changes. The strikes and demonstrations grew larger and more frequent. In June 1974, the Derg began arresting high government officials and military commanders who were loyal to the emperor. They accused these people of corruption and of causing Ethiopia's problems through their incompetence and greed. Each arrest weakened the emperor's power and made it clear that the Derg was becoming the real authority in the country. The emperor, who had survived so many challenges during his long career, seemed unable to understand how serious this threat was. He continued to believe that his personal authority and the respect people had for the monarchy would be enough to overcome this crisis. He had dealt with military coups before and had always emerged victorious. But this time was different. The Derg was not trying to replace the emperor with another member of the royal family or with a different type of traditional leader. They wanted to completely eliminate the monarchy and create an entirely new type of government based on socialist principles. Throughout the summer of 1974, the Derg systematically dismantled the emperor's government. They took control of the army, the police, and the government ministries. They began implementing radical reforms, including seizing land from wealthy landowners and redistributing it to poor farmers. They also nationalized banks, factories, and other businesses. The emperor found himself increasingly isolated in his palace, surrounded by a shrinking circle of loyal supporters. Many of his closest advisors fled the country or were arrested by the Derg. Even some members of his own family began to distance themselves from him as it became clear that his reign was coming to an end. On September 12, 1974, the inevitable finally happened. Soldiers from the Derg arrived at the palace and informed the emperor that he was being deposed. There was no dramatic confrontation or violent struggle. The old man who had once commanded the respect of world leaders simply nodded and accepted his fate with the dignity that had characterized his entire career. The announcement of the emperor's removal from power was broadcast on Ethiopian radio and television. The newsreader simply stated that Haile Selassie had been removed from his position due to his failure to address Ethiopia's economic and social problems. After 44 years as emperor and nearly 60 years in power, his reign was over. The former emperor was taken to a small building within his former palace compound, where he was kept under house arrest. The Derg allowed him to keep a few servants and some of his personal belongings, but he was no longer allowed to leave or to communicate with the outside world. For the man who had once traveled the world and met with presidents and kings, this imprisonment was perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. He had to watch from his window as the Derg destroyed everything he had built and implemented policies that he believed would harm Ethiopia. The final chapter of Haile Selassie's life was shrouded in mystery and sadness. On August 27, 1975, Ethiopian radio announced that the former emperor had died of respiratory failure. He was 83 years old. However, many people suspected that he had actually been murdered by the Derg, though this would not be confirmed until many years later. The Lion of Judah, who had roared so powerfully on the world stage for so many decades, had been silenced forever. The ancient Ethiopian monarchy that had lasted for thousands of years had come to an end, with the death of its last and most famous emperor. When Emperor Haile Selassie died in 1975, many people thought that his story was over and that history would quickly forget about the last emperor of Ethiopia. They were completely wrong. Nearly 50 years after his death, people around the world still remember and talk about this remarkable man who changed not just his own country but the entire world's understanding of Africa and its people. In Ethiopia itself, the memory of Haile Selassie remained complicated for many years after his death. The military government that overthrew him, led by Mengistu Haile Mariam, tried very hard to make people forget about the emperor. They removed his pictures from public buildings, changed the names of streets and schools that had been named after him, and told people that he had been a cruel dictator who had kept Ethiopia poor and backward. But many ordinary Ethiopians never believed these lies. They remembered that during the emperor's reign, Ethiopia had been respected around the world. They remembered the schools and hospitals he had built, the roads that connected their villages to the outside world, and the pride they had felt when other countries treated Ethiopia as an equal. Even though they were not allowed to say so publicly, many Ethiopians continued to honor the emperor's memory in their hearts. The military government that replaced Haile Selassie turned out to be much worse than anything Ethiopia had experienced under the monarchy. Mengistu's regime killed hundreds of thousands of people in what became known as the Red Terror. They forced farmers to live in collective villages, destroyed the economy through failed socialist policies, and led the country into even more devastating famines than the one that had helped bring down the emperor. By the 1990s, when Mengistu's government was finally overthrown, many Ethiopians had begun to look back on the emperor's reign as a golden age compared to what came after. They realized that, despite his faults, Haile Selassie had genuinely tried to improve their country and had succeeded in making Ethiopia respected around the world. In 1992, construction workers in Addis Ababa made a shocking discovery. While working on a building project in the area that had once been the royal palace, they found human remains buried under a concrete slab. Experts later confirmed that these were the bones of Emperor Haile Selassie, who had apparently been secretly buried there. After his death in 1975, this discovery led to a major debate in Ethiopia about how the country should remember its last emperor. Some people wanted to give him a proper burial with full honors, while others argued that he should be forgotten because of the mistakes he had made during his reign. After years of discussion, the Ethiopian government finally decided to allow a proper funeral for the emperor in the year 2000. The funeral ceremony was attended by thousands of Ethiopians and by representatives from many foreign countries. Members of the surviving royal family came from around the world to pay their respects. The ceremony showed that despite everything that had happened, many people still respected the emperor's contributions to Ethiopian history. But the most surprising place where Haile Selassie's memory remained alive was not in Ethiopia but in the Caribbean island of Jamaica, thousands of miles away across the ocean. In the 1930s, a religious movement called Rastafarianism had emerged in Jamaica, inspired by the teachings of a man named Marcus Garvey, who had told his followers to look to Africa for the crowning of a new black king. When Rastafari was crowned as Emperor Haile Selassie in 1930, many of Garvey's followers believed that this was the fulfillment of his prophecy. They began to worship Haile Selassie as a divine figure, calling him Jah Rastafari and believing that he was the Messiah who would lead black people around the world to freedom and dignity. The emperor himself never claimed to be divine and remained a devout Christian throughout his life. But the Rastafarian movement continued to grow, especially after it was popularized by reggae music and musicians like Bob Marley. Today, millions of people around the world know about Haile Selassie because of his connection to Rastafarianism and reggae music. The emperor's influence on the broader struggle for African independence and civil rights was enormous and lasting. His famous speech to the League of Nations in 1936, where he warned that aggression against Ethiopia would spread to other countries, proved to be prophetic when World War II broke out just 3 years later. More importantly, his vision of African unity and cooperation became reality when the Organization of African Unity was established in 1963 with its headquarters in Addis Ababa. This organization, which later became the African Union, continues to work for peace and development across Africa. Every time African leaders meet in Addis Ababa, they are reminded of the emperor's dream of a united and prosperous Africa. Many of the great African leaders who led their countries to independence in the 1960s and 1970s acknowledged that they had been inspired by Haile Selassie's example. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, and Nelson Mandela of South Africa all spoke respectfully about the Ethiopian emperor who had shown that African leaders could command respect on the world stage. The emperor's emphasis on education as the foundation of national development has also proven to be correct. The schools and universities he established continued to educate Ethiopian leaders even after his death. Many of the people who eventually overthrew the military government in the 1990s had been educated in institutions that the emperor had founded. Modern historians and scholars have developed a more balanced view of Haile Selassie's legacy. They recognize that he was not perfect and that he made serious mistakes, particularly in his failure to address poverty and inequality quickly enough. They also acknowledge that his autocratic style of government became outdated as the world moved toward more democratic forms of leadership. But these same historians also recognize that Haile Selassie achieved remarkable things during his long career. He kept Ethiopia independent when almost every other African country was under colonial rule. He modernized his country's infrastructure, education system, and government. He played a crucial role in establishing international organizations that promoted peace and cooperation. Perhaps most importantly, he showed the world that African leaders could be just as intelligent, dignified, and capable as any European or American politician. At a time when many people believed that Africans were inferior to other races, Haile Selassie proved that this was completely false. Today, when people study the history of the 20th century, they recognize Haile Selassie as one of the most important figures of his era. His life story teaches us that leadership requires not just intelligence and ambition, but also courage, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to principles that are bigger than personal interest. The boy who was born in the mountains of Ethiopia in 1892 grew up to become a man whose influence reached every corner of the world. Though empires may fall and governments may change, the impact of visionary leadership continues to shape the world long after the leaders themselves have passed away.